I sold my blood to buy groceries at 73 years old, never knowing that same blood would make me a multimillionaire and destroy the man who abandoned me. My name is Lorraine Mitchell, and I'm 79 now. But back when I was 70, freshly widowed after 42 years of marriage to my Robert, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I ignored every warning my children gave me and married Raymond Cole, a man 12 years younger who had a smile that made me forget I'd promised myself I'd never trust anyone again. Robert and I had built something real over 4 decades. We'd scrimped and saved, raised 3 kids in a modest house in Ohio, and by the time he passed from a heart attack, we'd managed to put away $360,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was ours, our security, our legacy for the kids. Then came Raymond with his charm and his compliments, telling me I was beautiful, that age was just a number, that I deserved to enjoy life after all those years of playing it safe. He made me feel young again, made me feel seen. My daughter Sarah begged me not to marry him. My sons practically staged an intervention. But I was stubborn, still am, and I thought I knew better. I was wrong. 3 years. That's all it took for Raymond to drain every penny of those savings. Expensive dinners he insisted on. A boat he just had to have. Investments that somehow never panned out. And then, when the money was gone and all that was left was a $190,000 mortgage he'd convinced me to take out, he looked at me across our kitchen table and said I was too old and too poor to be worth his time anymore. He left me at 73 with nothing but debt and shame. But here's what Raymond didn't know, what nobody knew. My body was carrying something more valuable than all that money he'd stolen. Something that had been inside me since I was 19 years old, waiting 54 years to change everything. Stay with me, and I'll tell you how the blood I sold just to eat became worth millions, and how the man who called me worthless ended up with less than nothing while I rebuilt an empire from my own veins. If you want to hear how a broke elderly woman became a multimillionaire by accident, hit that subscribe button, because this story gets better with every twist. The day Raymond left, I sat at that kitchen table for 6 hours straight, staring at the stack of bills he'd left behind like a parting gift. I was 73 years old, and for the first time since I was 17, I had no idea how I was going to survive the next month. The mortgage payment was due in 3 weeks. The property taxes were overdue. The refrigerator had been making a dying sound for 2 months, and I'd been ignoring it because I knew I couldn't afford to replace it. My daughter Sarah came over that evening and found me still sitting there in the dark. She didn't say "I told you so," which made it worse somehow. She just held my hand and asked what I needed. I told her I needed to figure out how to pay for food, and I watched my successful, put-together daughter try not to cry. Sarah offered money. So did my sons, David and Michael. But they had their own families, their own mortgages, their own kids heading to college. I'd already failed them once by letting Raymond take what should have been their inheritance. I wasn't going to become their burden too. That's when I started looking for work. At 73, nobody wants to hire you. I applied to be a greeter at Walmart. I tried to get a job at the library. I even applied to clean houses, something I'd done when Robert and I were first married and desperate. Every single place looked at my application, looked at my age, and suddenly the position was filled. I was 2 weeks from losing the house when I saw the advertisement at the grocery store. BioLife Plasma Services was looking for donors. They paid $120 a week for 2 donations. It wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, they didn't care how old you were as long as you were healthy. I remember walking into that plasma center for the first time, seeing the rows of recliners with people hooked up to machines, their blood flowing out through tubes. Most of them were young, college kids trying to make rent money. Then there was me, a 73-year-old woman who'd somehow ended up in the same desperate boat. The intake nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, who couldn't have been older than 30, asked me the standard questions. Any diseases? Any recent illnesses? Any history of infections? I told her about the meningitis I'd had at 19, back in 1965. I'd been a sophomore in college, planning to become a teacher when I suddenly got sick. My roommate found me unconscious in our dorm room. The doctor said I was lucky to survive, that the infection had been severe. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital and another month recovering at my parents' house. It derailed my education, changed my whole life path, but I survived. Patricia made a note in my file and said it shouldn't be a problem. Ancient history, she called it. If only we'd known. That first donation took about 90 minutes. I lay in that recliner watching my blood flow through the machine, getting separated and returned, and I thought about how far I'd fallen. Here I was, selling my plasma like some desperate kid, when 3 years ago I'd had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But $120 a week meant I could buy groceries. It meant I could keep the lights on. It meant I could hold on just a little bit longer while I figured out what to do about the mortgage. I became a regular at that plasma center. Twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I'd show up at 7 when they opened. I got to know the other regulars, mostly young people, but a few older folks like me who'd hit hard times. We didn't talk much about why we were there. That was an unspoken rule. Patricia always took care of me. She'd check my vitals, make sure I was hydrated, ask about my grandkids. She was gentle with the needle, which I appreciated because my veins weren't what they used to be. Sometimes she'd sneak me an extra snack pack of cookies. For 18 months, this was my life. Twice a week, selling my plasma for grocery money, watching every penny, eating a lot of rice and beans, avoiding my children's phone calls when I knew they wanted to help because I was too proud to take their money. The mortgage company started foreclosure proceedings at month 14. I managed to get them to hold off by making partial payments, promising I'd catch up, begging for more time. The woman on the phone was sympathetic but firm. They'd given me extensions already. I had maybe 6 more months before they'd force a sale. I was 74.5 years old, and I was going to lose my home. The home where Robert and I had raised our children, where we'd celebrated Christmases and birthdays, where he'd died in our bed with me holding his hand. Raymond had taken my money, but losing this house felt like losing Robert all over again. Then came the Tuesday morning that changed everything. I'd just finished my donation and was in the recovery area eating my cookies when Patricia came out with another woman I'd never seen before. This woman was older, maybe 50, wearing a sharp business suit that looked out of place in a plasma center. She was carrying a tablet and had that intense look people get when they're about to deliver important news. Patricia bent down next to my recliner, and I could see excitement in her eyes mixed with something else. Disbelief, maybe. She told me there was someone from BioLife's corporate research division who needed to talk to me about my plasma. Something about my recent screening results. The woman in the suit introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, head of antibody research. She asked if we could speak privately, and suddenly my heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with just having donated plasma. We went into a small office at the back of the center. Dr. Chen pulled up something on her tablet, a bunch of charts and numbers that meant nothing to me. Then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She told me my plasma contained something extraordinary. Dr. Chen explained it to me 3 times before I started to understand, and even then, I'm not sure I fully grasped what she was saying. The meningitis I'd had at 19, back in 1965, had been caused by a particularly rare and aggressive strain of bacteria. My body had fought it off, barely, but in the process, my immune system had created these incredibly specific antibodies. For 54 years, those antibodies had just been floating around in my bloodstream, doing nothing, waiting. Apparently, there was a new strain of meningitis emerging, something resistant to current treatments, and it was killing people. Dr. Chen told me they'd been searching for years for someone whose immune system had encountered something similar. They'd tested thousands of plasma samples from their database. Mine was the only one that matched. She used words like breakthrough and life-saving and unprecedented. But the word that caught my attention was the one she almost whispered, valuable. I sat in that tiny office with its flickering fluorescent light and asked the question that mattered. If my plasma was so special, so rare, what was it worth? Dr. Chen got very careful then. She explained that BioLife would want to negotiate for the rights to my plasma, to use it for research and treatment development. She couldn't give me exact numbers sitting there, but she mentioned that in similar cases, compensation had ranged from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. I thought I'd misheard her. I asked her to repeat that last part. Millions. She said millions. I started laughing, right there in her face. Because what else do you do when you've spent 18 months selling your blood for $120 a week only to find out it's worth millions? I laughed until tears ran down my face, and Dr. Chen probably thought I'd lost my mind. She told me someone from their legal team would contact me within 48 hours to discuss terms. She made me promise not to donate anywhere else, not to talk about this with anyone until the lawyers worked everything out. Then she shook my hand like I was somebody important and walked me back out to the lobby. Patricia gave me a hug and told me she was happy for me, that if anyone deserved good luck, it was me. I didn't tell her that luck had nothing to do with it. This was my body's payment for nearly dying at 19. A bill 54 years overdue. I drove home in my 20-year-old Honda that needed new tires I couldn't afford, and I didn't let myself believe it was real. I'd learned the hard way not to count money I didn't have in my hand. Raymond had taught me that lesson thoroughly. But that night, I did something I hadn't done in 18 months. I called Sarah and told her everything. My daughter cried on the phone. Happy tears this time. She made me promise to get a lawyer before signing anything, to not let them take advantage of me. I promised, even though I had no idea how I'd pay for a lawyer. Sarah said she'd take care of it. She knew someone, a friend from college who specialized in medical contracts. His name was James Porter, and he owed her a favor. She'd call him first thing in the morning. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I kept expecting someone to call and tell me there'd been a mistake, that they'd read the results wrong, that I wasn't special after all. But the call that came was from a law firm representing BioLife, asking when I could come in to discuss terms. James Porter met me at a coffee shop before the meeting. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, but Sarah trusted him, and that was enough for me. He'd already done research, he told me. Cases like mine were rare, but not unprecedented. He knew what to ask for, what was reasonable, what rights I needed to protect. He told me not to seem too eager, not to accept their first offer, and absolutely not to sign anything that day, no matter what they promised. The meeting was at BioLife's regional headquarters, in a conference room with a view of the city that I knew I'd never be able to afford, even with a lottery win. There were 4 people from their side, 2 lawyers, Dr. Chen, and a man who introduced himself as the Vice President of Research Development. They made their offer within 15 minutes. $250,000 for unlimited rights to my plasma, plus a waiver releasing them from any future claims. James looked at me and gave the smallest shake of his head. I told them I needed time to think about it. The VP looked surprised. He explained that this was a very generous offer, that most donors would be thrilled with that amount. He reminded me that without their research capabilities, my plasma was worthless. He suggested, very gently, that someone in my financial situation couldn't afford to be unrealistic. That last part made me angry. He'd done his homework, knew about my foreclosure proceedings, knew I was desperate. He thought he could lowball me because I was a broke old woman with no options. I stood up and thanked them for their time. James and I walked out. In the elevator, he told me he'd done that negotiation exactly right. They'd come back with a better offer within a week. He guaranteed it. The fact that they'd called the meeting so quickly meant they were desperate. Someone was dying, probably multiple someones, and my plasma was the only thing that could save them. I asked him what he thought my plasma was actually worth. He pulled out his phone and showed me a case from 2018. A man in California whose blood contained an antibody for Rh disease. He'd donated for 60 years, and his blood had saved over 2 million babies. When he retired, They estimated he'd contributed plasma worth over $1 billion to the medical industry. I sat down on the bench in the lobby because my legs suddenly didn't work. James explained that my situation was different, but the principle was the same. My plasma could save lives and make pharmaceutical companies enormous profits. I deserved fair compensation. And fair wasn't $250,000. He told me to go home and wait. Don't call them, don't respond to their messages, let them sweat. I went home, and for the first time in 18 months, I slept through the night without waking up worried about money. 3 days later, they called back. They wanted to meet again, to discuss a revised offer. This time, the VP brought a different tone, less condescending, more respectful. They'd had time to run more tests, he explained. My plasma was even more valuable than they'd initially thought. The antibodies could potentially treat not just the new strain of meningitis, but several related conditions. Their new offer was $1.8 million, plus annual royalties of 5% on any treatments developed using my plasma. James asked for 24 hours to review. In the coffee shop afterward, he told me we had them. They wouldn't have jumped from $250,000 to $1.8 million unless they were desperate. He thought we could get more. I asked him how much more. He suggested we counter with $3 million upfront and 15% royalties. I looked at this young lawyer who was fighting for me like I was family, and I told him to do whatever he thought was right. At this point, any number with that many zeros would change my life. We went back and forth for another week. They came up to $2.5 million. We held firm at $3 million. Finally, they agreed to $3.2 million up front, plus 12% royalties on any treatments developed using my plasma for the next 20 years. James made them add clauses protecting my privacy, limiting how many times per year they could collect, and guaranteeing top medical care for me for life. The day I signed those papers, I was 75 years old. The check took 2 weeks to clear, and I spent those 2 weeks afraid to believe it was real. But it was real. $3.2 million deposited into an account that had contained $87 the day before. The first thing I did was pay off the mortgage, all $190,000 of it. The foreclosure department couldn't believe it when I called with the payoff amount. The woman I'd been begging for extensions actually congratulated me. The second thing I did was write checks to each of my 3 children. Not the full amount I'd lost to Raymond, but enough to make a difference. Enough to help with their mortgages, their kids' college funds, the things they'd been struggling with while worrying about me. Sarah cried again when she got the check. She tried to refuse it, said I needed that money for myself. I told her I had plenty, that this was always meant to be theirs anyway. Raymond had stolen their inheritance, and I was giving it back. The third thing I did was start looking for Raymond. Finding Raymond wasn't difficult. He'd never been particularly smart about covering his tracks, and desperation makes people careless. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Rita Gonzalez, who came highly recommended by James Porter. Rita was in her 50s, no nonsense, and she didn't ask why a 75-year-old woman wanted to track down her ex-husband. She just took my money and got to work. It took her less than a week. Raymond was living in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a gated community that screamed wealth. He'd moved there about 8 months after leaving me, and Rita's report included photographs that made my blood pressure spike even with the medication I was taking. He was with another woman. Her name was Diane Hartford. She was 72 years old, and according to public records, she'd been widowed 2 years ago when her husband, a successful real estate developer, had died and left her an estate worth approximately $4 million. The photographs showed Raymond looking tanned and healthy, playing golf, dining at expensive restaurants, driving a BMW that definitely wasn't his. He'd found himself another wealthy widow to leech off, and judging by the timeline, he'd probably been setting it up before he even left me. Rita's report was thorough. She'd done deep background work, talked to neighbors, checked social media. Diane Hartford had 2 adult children who lived out of state and visited rarely. She'd been lonely after her husband died, vulnerable, probably desperate for companionship. Sound familiar? The report also included something interesting. Diane's children had hired their own investigator 6 months ago to look into Raymond. They were suspicious, protective, worried about their mother and their inheritance. Their investigator had found Raymond's previous marriage to me, the timeline of our divorce, and the fact that he'd left me in financial ruin. They'd presented this information to their mother. According to Rita's sources, there had been a massive fight. But Diane had defended Raymond, insisted his ex-wife was bitter and lying, claimed that love was more important than money. I knew exactly how that conversation had gone, because I'd had the same one with my own children 3 years earlier. Rita asked me what I wanted to do with this information. I told her I needed some time to think about it. But I already knew what I was going to do. I spent the next month preparing carefully. I wanted Raymond to know what he'd lost, what he'd thrown away when he decided I was too old and too poor. But I didn't want to just tell him. I wanted him to feel it, to understand the magnitude of his mistake in a way that would haunt him. James warned me to be careful, told me that anything that could be considered harassment could jeopardize the agreement with BioLife if it became public. I assured him I wasn't planning to do anything illegal or even confrontational. I just wanted to send some information. I started by having Rita continue monitoring Raymond's situation in Scottsdale. I wanted to know his routine, his vulnerabilities, the cracks in his new perfect life. It turned out there were plenty of cracks. Diane's children hadn't given up. They were applying pressure, threatening to contest their father's will if their mother married Raymond, making her choose between them and him. Rita's sources said the relationship was strained, that Raymond was getting nervous, that he'd started being more careful with money since Diane had tightened her purse strings. Perfect. I also did something that felt petty but satisfied me deeply. I started donating to charities in Robert's name. Our local hospital, the library where we used to take the kids, the animal shelter where we'd adopted our dog 30 years ago. Not huge amounts, but enough that my name appeared in their donor newsletters and on their websites. I knew Raymond still had friends back in Ohio, people who'd see those newsletters, who'd talk. I wanted word to get back to him that the woman he'd left penniless was suddenly making charitable donations. Then I waited. It took 6 weeks for the first contact. An email from an address I didn't recognize, asking if I was the Lorraine Mitchell who used to be married to Raymond Cole. The tone was casual, friendly, curious. I didn't respond. 3 days later, another email, this time more direct. Someone claiming to be an old friend of Raymond's, mentioning they'd heard I'd come into some money, asking if it was true. I deleted it without responding. Raymond was fishing, trying to figure out if the rumors were true, probably not wanting to reach out directly in case I was still angry. He was being careful, strategic, the same way he'd been careful when he first started courting me after Robert died. Rita called me with an update. Her sources in Scottsdale reported that Raymond had been asking questions about me, that he'd been distracted lately, making mistakes. He'd gotten into an argument with Diane about something, and she'd been seen having lunch with her lawyer. Things were falling apart for him, and he was starting to panic. I decided it was time. I drafted a letter, not an email, not a text message, but an actual letter on good stationery with my name embossed at the top. James reviewed it for me, made sure there was nothing that could be used against me legally. The letter was simple and factual. I told Raymond that I was writing to inform him of a change in my circumstances that he might find relevant. I explained, in clinical detail, about the discovery of the antibodies in my plasma, the negotiations with BioLife, and the final settlement of $3.2 million plus ongoing royalties. I mentioned that the plasma donations I'd been making, the ones that had sustained me during the 18 months after he left me with nothing, had turned out to be worth a fortune. I thanked him, in a way, because if he hadn't drained my savings and forced me into that desperate situation, I never would have been donating plasma when BioLife discovered what I had. I told him the house was paid off, that I'd been able to restore my children's inheritance, and that I was considering my options for the future. Perhaps some travel, perhaps some investments, perhaps just enjoying the security of knowing I'd never be vulnerable again. I closed by wishing him well with his new relationship and suggesting he might want to be more careful this time about assessing someone's true value. I didn't mention anything about knowing where he lived or who he was with. I wanted him to wonder how much I knew, how I'd found out, whether I was watching. I mailed the letter to his address in Scottsdale, certified mail with signature required. Then I sat back and waited for the explosion. Raymond received the letter on a Thursday afternoon. I know because Rita had someone watching, and they reported that he signed for it himself at the door of Diane's house. The phone call came 6 hours later. I was having dinner with Sarah and her family when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Arizona area code. I excused myself and went out to the porch to answer. Raymond's voice hit me like a slap. He was angry, demanding to know if what I'd written was true. He called me a liar, said I was making it up to hurt him, accused me of trying to ruin his relationship. I let him rant for about 30 seconds. Then I very calmly told him that every word was true, that I had the bank statements and legal documents to prove it, and that his opinion didn't matter since our divorce had been finalized 2 years ago. He switched tactics immediately. His voice got softer, almost pleading. He reminded me of the good times we'd had. Suggested that maybe we'd both made mistakes, asked if we could meet to talk things through. I told him no. He got angry again, started yelling about marital assets, claiming that since the plasma in my body had been there during our marriage, he was entitled to a portion of the settlement. He threatened to call his lawyer, to sue me, to take me to court. That's when I smiled, standing there on my daughter's porch in the evening air. I told him that he was welcome to try, but that James Porter had anticipated exactly that argument. The plasma itself had no value until BioLife identified the antibodies 18 months after our divorce was final. The value was created by their research, not by anything that existed during our marriage. I could hear him breathing hard on the other end of the line. Then I added that if he did try to sue me, the discovery process would be very interesting. It would require examining his financial conduct during our marriage, how he'd spent my savings, everything he'd done. It would all become part of the public record. There was a long silence. Finally, he asked how much I'd give him to go away quietly. I laughed, actually laughed out loud. I told him I wouldn't give him a single penny, not now, not ever. Then I hung up. He called back 7 times that night. I didn't answer. Rita called me the next morning with an update. Her source reported that there had been a massive fight at Diane's house the previous night. Neighbors had heard shouting. Diane's daughter had shown up at 10 p.m. Raymond had been seen leaving with a suitcase early in the morning. Apparently, Diane had overheard part of Raymond's phone call with me. She'd heard him yelling about marital assets and money, heard him trying to get a settlement from his ex-wife. It confirmed everything her children had been telling her about him. She'd kicked him out. But I wasn't satisfied yet. Raymond had made me feel worthless, had abandoned me when I needed help most. I wanted him to understand fully what he'd lost. So I had Rita compile a complete dossier on Raymond's pattern of behavior. It went back further than just me. She found 2 other relationships before Diane, both with older widowed women who'd had money. In both cases, Raymond had gotten what he could and moved on. There was a woman in Florida he'd been engaged to for 6 months before she discovered he'd taken out credit cards in her name. There was another in Nevada whose children had managed to get a restraining order against him. He had a pattern. He targeted lonely widows, made them feel special, gained access to their finances, and disappeared when things fell apart or he found a better opportunity. I wasn't his first victim. Rita suggested I could report him to the authorities. But I had a better idea. I created a simple document containing the facts about Raymond's pattern, the timeline of his relationships, the financial damage he'd left behind. I included public records, court documents, testimony from the other women, no speculation, no opinion, just documented facts. Then I created a website. Nothing fancy, just a single page with the information laid out clearly. I titled it, Financial Elder Abuse Awareness, the Raymond Cole Case Study. I registered it under a privacy service so my name wasn't attached. Then, I made sure it was optimized for search engines. Anyone who searched Raymond's name would find it on the first page of results. James was uncomfortable with this approach, warned me about potential defamation issues, but I'd been careful. Everything on the site was factual, documented, and true. I wasn't making accusations. I was presenting a case study using public records. Rita reported that Raymond had tried to reconcile with Diane. He'd shown up at her house with flowers, apologizing, claiming I was a bitter ex-wife making up lies. Diane's son had been there, and he'd pulled up my website on his phone right there in the foyer. Raymond left quickly after that. Over the next few weeks, Rita tracked Raymond's increasingly desperate attempts to find another situation. He tried contacting the woman from Florida, but her daughter told him if he came near her mother again, she'd call the police. He joined senior dating websites using a fake last name, but the website kept appearing whenever anyone did basic due diligence. His credibility was destroyed. His pattern was exposed. Meanwhile, the royalties from BioLife started coming in. The first payment was $47,000, representing the first 3 months of treatment sales. Dr. Chen called to tell me that the therapy developed from my plasma was saving lives, that children with the new meningitis strain were surviving because of antibodies from my blood. I was 75 years old, and my body was doing more good than it had in decades. I started traveling. Small trips at first, places Robert and I had always talked about visiting, but never had the money for. Maine to see the lighthouses, the Grand Canyon, a week in Charleston walking through gardens. Sarah went with me sometimes, and we talked about her father, about how proud he would have been to see me survive this. But I kept thinking about what Raymond had said during that phone call, about marital assets and entitlement. It bothered me that he thought he deserved something from me. That's when I decided to make sure my story was told properly. 6 months after I sent Raymond that letter, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Chen. BioLife wanted to expand their research, and they needed more comprehensive medical history from me, going all the way back to childhood if possible. She asked if I had any old medical records, anything from the original meningitis infection in 1965. I told her I'd have to check, but I doubted anything from that long ago still existed. That conversation sent me digging through boxes in my attic that I hadn't opened in years. Robert and I had been pack rats, keeping everything from our marriage, from our children's childhoods, from our own younger years. I'd almost thrown it all out when Raymond was pushing me to declutter, to modernize, to let go of the past. Thank God I hadn't listened to him. I found my old college records in a banker's box that smelled like dust and memories, my transcripts from 1964 and 1965, letters from my parents, and tucked in a manila folder, copies of my hospital records from the meningitis that had nearly killed me at 19. I sat on my attic floor reading through them, seeing my younger self through the clinical language of doctors who'd fought to save my life. The infection had been severe, they'd noted. Unusual strain. Patient's immune response remarkably strong. Full recovery unexpected, but achieved. I called Dr. Chen and told her I'd found the records. She asked me to send copies immediately. 2 weeks later, she called back with news that made the original discovery seem small by comparison. The hospital records contained detailed information about the specific bacterial strain I'd fought off. That information, combined with current analysis of my plasma, revealed something their research team hadn't fully understood before. My antibodies weren't just effective against the new meningitis strain. They showed promise against an entire family of drug-resistant bacteria. The potential applications were enormous. The value was exponentially higher than anyone had anticipated. BioLife wanted to renegotiate our agreement. James flew in from Chicago to meet with me. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Raymond had told me I was worthless, and James explained what this meant. The original agreement had been generous, but it had been based on a single application. This new discovery opened up multiple treatment possibilities. He told me we could renegotiate for a significantly higher royalty percentage, possibly even additional upfront payment. But there was a catch. BioLife wanted exclusive rights to share my medical history with research partners, to use my case in scientific publications, to essentially make me a case study. My privacy would be protected legally, he assured me. They'd use codes and pseudonyms. But in the medical research community, people would know who I was. I thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. If my nearly dying at 19 could save lives now, if my body could do this much good, then I didn't care who knew about it. We went back to the negotiating table. This time, I knew my worth. This time, I wasn't a desperate woman selling plasma for grocery money. The new agreement took 3 weeks to hammer out. James fought for every percentage point, every protection, every clause. The final terms. Royalty percentage increased from 12 to 18%, a one-time additional payment of $1.5 million, and guaranteed involvement in any decisions about how my case was presented publicly. The additional payment cleared 2 days before my 76th birthday. $4.7 million total now, plus royalties that were increasing every quarter as new treatments reached the market. But the real resource I'd secured wasn't the money. It was the documentation, the proof, the irrefutable evidence that my value had nothing to do with my age or my bank account. I was saving lives with blood I'd nearly sold for $120 a week. I thought about Raymond constantly during those negotiations. I imagined his face if he knew that the plasma donations he'd indirectly forced me into were now generating millions. The plasma that had kept me fed when he left me with nothing was now worth more than everything he'd stolen from me. Rita called with an update. Her sources reported that Raymond was working at a hardware store in Tucson. Not managing, not even assistant managing. Working the floor, helping customers find paint and garden supplies, making probably $15 an hour. He was 73 years old, the same age I'd been when he'd abandoned me, and he was exactly where he'd tried to put me. Desperate, struggling, alone. Diane had apparently put word out through her social circle about what Raymond had done. The wealthy widow community in Arizona, it turned out, was smaller than you'd think. They all knew each other, talked to each other, warned each other. Raymond's name was poison now, but I wasn't done yet. I had one more move to make, one final piece to put in place. I contacted a writer I'd been following online, a woman who specialized in stories about elder abuse and financial exploitation. Her name was Margaret Chen, no relation to Dr. Sarah Chen, and she'd written several viral articles about scams targeting seniors. I told her I had a story she might be interested in. Not for revenge, I explained, but for awareness. To help other widows recognize the warning signs, to show that recovery was possible, to prove that underestimating someone because of their age was a costly mistake. Margaret was interested, very interested. We spent hours on the phone over the next month. I told her everything, meeting Raymond, ignoring my children's warnings, watching my savings disappear, the mortgage, the plasma donations, the discovery, the settlement, and Raymond's reaction when he found out what he'd lost. She wanted to use my real name. She said the story would have more impact, would help more people if I was willing to go public. I thought about it for a week. Then I said yes. The article was scheduled to run in a major online publication that reached millions of readers. Margaret sent me the draft for approval. She'd titled it, "The Widow Who Sold Her Blood and Became a Millionaire, a Story of Exploitation, Survival, and Unexpected Justice." It was fair, factual, and devastating. She'd interviewed James, Dr. Chen, even Patricia from the Plasma Center. She'd documented Raymond's pattern with the other women. She'd included quotes from financial elder abuse experts about warning signs and prevention, and she'd made me the hero of my own story. The article was set to publish in 2 weeks. Margaret asked if I wanted to give Raymond advance warning. I told her absolutely not. Let him find out the same way the rest of the world would. The article published on a Tuesday morning in October. exactly 3 years after Raymond had walked out of my life. Margaret called me at dawn to tell me it was live. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at my computer, and read my own story as if it had happened to someone else. Seeing it all laid out like that, in clean journalistic prose, made me realize just how much I'd survived. The comments started rolling in within minutes. Hundreds of them, then thousands. People sharing their own stories of exploitation, thanking me for speaking out, celebrating what they called my triumph. The article went viral by lunchtime. By evening, it had been shared over 100,000 times. News outlets were picking it up, requesting interviews. My phone didn't stop ringing. Sarah called, crying again, but proud this time. She said people at her office had been sharing the article, not knowing it was about her mother. When she told them, they'd applauded. My sons called. Friends I hadn't heard from in years called. Even Patricia from the Plasma Center called to say she'd recognized me immediately and was so happy things had worked out. But the call I was waiting for didn't come until Wednesday afternoon. Rita phoned to tell me that Raymond had been confronted at work by a coworker who'd read the article. According to her source, he'd denied it at first, claimed it was about someone else, but his coworker had shown him the details. The timeline, the locations, the amounts. It was clearly him. He'd left work early, visibly shaken. That evening I finally got the call I'd been expecting. Not from Raymond directly, but from a lawyer representing him. The lawyer's voice was professional but strained. He informed me that his client was considering legal action for defamation and invasion of privacy. I told him to have his client call James Porter, gave him the number, and hung up. James called me 20 minutes later, laughing. He said Raymond's lawyer had called, made the same threats, and James had calmly explained that truth is an absolute defense against defamation. Every fact in the article was documented and provable. As for privacy, Raymond had no reasonable expectation of privacy regarding public records, court documents, and his own actions. The lawyer had backed down quickly, admitted his client didn't have the resources for a prolonged legal battle anyway, and suggested perhaps everyone could just move on. James told him that ship had sailed when his client chose to exploit vulnerable widows for money. But the article did something I hadn't fully anticipated. It brought people out of the woodwork. A woman named Patricia Morrison, no relation to my Patricia, contacted Margaret and asked to be put in touch with me. She was 68, living in Oregon, and Raymond had targeted her sister 4 years ago. Her sister had lost $40,000 before the family intervened. She'd been too ashamed to report it. Patricia wanted to know if there was anything that could be done now. I connected her with James. He reached out to the other women Rita had found, the ones from Florida and Nevada. Together, they built a case that went beyond any single incident. It turned out that when you documented a pattern across multiple states, across multiple victims, with a clear methodology, it stopped being a civil matter. It became criminal. James contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They were interested, very interested. I wasn't directly involved in what happened next. James kept me updated, but the legal process took on a life of its own. The FBI investigation, the interviews with victims, the examination of bank records and timelines. 6 months after the article published, Raymond was indicted on multiple counts of financial elder abuse, wire fraud, and identity theft related to the credit cards he'd opened in the Florida woman's name. Rita called to tell me he'd been arrested at the hardware store, walked out in handcuffs in front of his coworkers and customers. I wish I could say I felt nothing, that I was above petty satisfaction. But I'd be lying. I felt a deep, profound sense of justice. The trial was set for the following spring. I wouldn't have to testify since my situation fell outside the statute of limitations, but the prosecutor wanted me there. He said my story provided context, showed the full scope of Raymond's pattern. I told him I'd be there. But before the trial, something else happened that brought everything full circle. BioLife contacted me about a ceremony they were planning. The treatment developed from my plasma had now saved over 300 lives, mostly children with the drug-resistant meningitis. They wanted to recognize my contribution publicly, to present me with an award at their annual research gala. Dr. Chen called personally to extend the invitation. She told me that some of the families whose children had survived wanted to meet me, to thank me. I said yes before she finished asking. The gala was scheduled for December, black tie, at a luxury hotel in Boston. Sarah insisted on going with me, on buying me a dress that cost more than my first car. I looked at myself in the mirror the night of the gala. 77 years old, wearing a dress that actually fit properly, my hair done professionally, wearing jewelry I'd bought for myself with money I'd earned through my own body's unexpected gift. 3 years ago, I'd been selling plasma for grocery money, facing foreclosure, convinced my life was over. The ceremony was beautiful. Dr. Chen gave a presentation about the research, showed slides of the molecular structure of my antibodies, explained in terms I barely understood how my immune system's response from 1965 had saved lives in 2024. Then she invited me up to the stage. The ballroom was full of researchers, doctors, pharmaceutical executives, and in the front rows, families. I could see parents holding children who looked healthy and alive because of plasma I donated when I thought I was worthless. I accepted the award, a crystal sculpture that caught the light and threw rainbows. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I told them about Raymond, not his name, just the story, about being left with nothing at 73, about the plasma donations, about discovering that survival sometimes comes with unexpected gifts, about how the worst betrayal of my life had led directly to this moment. I told them that sometimes our value isn't diminished by age or circumstances or other people's cruelty. Sometimes it's just waiting to be discovered, running through our veins, ready to do good in the world if we can just survive long enough to let it. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then everyone stood up and the applause was deafening. A woman approached me afterward, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8. She told me her daughter had contracted the new meningitis strain last year, that the doctors had said there was nothing they could do, that they should prepare to say goodbye. Then the experimental treatment became available, the one developed from my plasma. Her daughter had been one of the first to receive it. The little girl looked up at me with huge brown eyes and said, "Thank you." I knelt down, not caring about my expensive dress or my 77-year-old knees, and hugged this child who was alive because I'd been desperate enough to sell my blood. That night, in my hotel room, I called my children, all 3 of them, one after another. I told them I loved them, that I was proud of the lives they'd built, that their father would have been so proud too. And I told them that tomorrow I was going to Arizona to watch Raymond's trial begin. The courthouse in Phoenix was smaller than I expected, almost mundane for a place where justice was supposed to be served. I sat in the gallery with Sarah beside me, James on my other side. The prosecutor had wanted me there for the opening statements, said my presence would remind the jury that these weren't victimless crimes, that real people had suffered. Raymond was led in wearing a suit that didn't fit quite right, probably borrowed or bought secondhand. He was thinner than in the photographs Rita had shown me, his tan faded, his hair grayer. He looked exactly like what he was, a 73-year-old man facing federal charges with no resources and no options. He saw me immediately. I watched his face go pale, watched him lean over to whisper something urgent to his public defender. The lawyer glanced back at me, then shook his head at whatever Raymond had asked. The judge entered, and we all stood. Judge Margaret Thornton, 60-something, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She ran her courtroom with efficiency and no tolerance for games. The prosecution's opening statement laid out Raymond's pattern with clinical precision. 4 victims across 3 states over 8 years. Total financial damage exceeding $300,000. A clear methodology. Target recently widowed women with assets. Isolate them from protective family members, gain access to finances, extract maximum value, disappear when challenged. They called it what it was, predatory elder abuse. The defense's opening was weaker, trying to frame everything as relationships gone bad, misunderstandings about money, he said, she said situations. The public defender was young, overworked, and clearly didn't have much to work with. The prosecution brought their witnesses methodically. First was Susan Martinez from Florida, 70 years old, who testified about how Raymond had opened credit cards in her name without permission. She cried on the stand, describing how her credit had been destroyed, how her daughter had discovered the fraud only by accident. Then came Alice Peterson from Nevada, 69, whose testimony was even more damaging. She'd been the one whose children got the restraining order. She described how Raymond had tried to convince her to cut off contact with her sons, had told her they were just after her money, had isolated her systematically. She looked at Raymond while she testified. He wouldn't meet her eyes. On the second day, they called Diane Hartford. I hadn't known she was testifying. Neither had Raymond, apparently, because he sat up straight when she walked in, looking healthier and more composed than in any of Rita's surveillance photos. Diane's testimony was devastating precisely because she'd loved him. She described how charming he'd been, how attentive, how he'd made her feel young again after her husband's death. She talked about the red flags her children had noticed that she'd ignored, the way he'd always needed just a little more money, how he'd slowly taken control of her finances. Then she testified about the phone call she'd overheard, the one to me, how she'd heard Raymond demanding money, threatening legal action, trying to extract payment from yet another ex-wife, how everything had suddenly become clear. The prosecutor asked if she'd suffered financial losses. Diane said yes, approximately $80,000, but more importantly, she'd almost lost her relationship with her children. She'd almost cut them off because Raymond had convinced her they were the problem. She looked at Raymond then, and her voice was steady. She said she'd been lucky that her children had fought for her, that they'd investigated him, that they'd found the truth before it was too late. She said not everyone had been that lucky. During the lunch recess, I found myself face to face with Diane in the courthouse cafeteria. She recognized me immediately from the article. We sat down together. Two women who'd both fallen for the same con, both been targeted by the same predator. She apologized to me. Actually apologized, as if any of it had been her fault. She said she'd read the article, knew what I'd been through, knew that her situation with Raymond had come right after he'd destroyed my life. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. We'd both been vulnerable, both been lonely, both been targeted by someone who'd made a career out of exploiting that vulnerability. We talked for 20 minutes, comparing notes, finding the same patterns, the same phrases, the same tactics. It was like comparing scripts from the same play. Before we went back to the courtroom, Diane told me something that I hadn't known. Raymond had tried to contact her from jail, had called collect, had tried to convince her to help him with legal fees. He'd told her that if she still loved him, she'd understand this was all a misunderstanding. She'd refused the call. The trial lasted 4 more days. The prosecution built their case piece by piece, document by document, witness by witness. Bank records showing the pattern of financial extraction. Emails where Raymond had used almost identical language with different women. Testimony from a financial crimes expert explaining how these scams worked. The defense tried to argue that these had been genuine relationships, that the money had been gifts, that the women had been willing participants. But the pattern was too clear, the methodology too consistent. On the final day, the prosecutor called one last witness, a surprise witness that even James hadn't known about. It was Patricia Morrison's sister, the woman from Oregon whose case had fallen outside the statute of limitations, but who'd agreed to testify about Raymond's pattern. Her name was Jennifer Morrison, and she was 66 now. She described meeting Raymond in 2018, how he'd courted her after her husband died, how he'd convinced her to refinance her house to invest in a business opportunity that never materialized, how she'd lost $40,000 and nearly lost her home. She testified that when her sister Patricia confronted Raymond, he'd disappeared overnight. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. She'd later discovered he'd emptied her savings account on his way out of town. Jennifer looked directly at the jury and said she'd spent years thinking it was her fault, that she'd been stupid, that she deserved what happened. Then she'd read the article about me, contacted Margaret, and realized she'd been targeted, not by someone who loved her, but by someone who'd seen her as a mark. The defense had nothing to counter with. Raymond didn't testify, probably on his lawyer's advice, because what could he say? The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Raymond's face crumpled when the verdict was read. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but there was nothing to say. The pattern had been too clear, the evidence too overwhelming, the testimony too consistent. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. The prosecutor told us Raymond was looking at 8 to 12 years in federal prison. He'd be 85 when he got out, if he lived that long. I should have felt triumphant. This was everything I'd wanted, wasn't it? Justice, revenge, vindication. But sitting in that courtroom watching Raymond be led away in handcuffs, I mostly felt tired. Tired of carrying anger, tired of thinking about him, tired of letting him take up space in my head. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. They wanted statements, reactions, quotes. Margaret had warned me this would happen. I kept it simple. I said I was grateful for the justice system, grateful for the prosecutors who'd taken these crimes seriously, grateful for the other women who'd been brave enough to come forward. A reporter asked if I felt vindicated after what Raymond had done to me. I thought about that question for a moment. Then I told her that Raymond hadn't just done something to me. He'd inadvertently given me a gift. By leaving me desperate enough to donate plasma, he'd put me in the position to discover something valuable. By abandoning me at 73, he'd freed me to rebuild a life that was entirely mine. I said the best revenge was that I'd turned his worst cruelty into my greatest triumph, and he'd have to live with knowing that for the rest of his life. Then Sarah and I walked away from the courthouse, and I didn't look back. Raymond was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison 6 weeks after the verdict. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd already given him enough of my time. James called to tell me the details. The judge had been harsh, citing the vulnerability of the victims, the calculated nature of the crimes, and the lack of remorse. Raymond would serve his time at a minimum security federal facility in California. With good behavior, he might get out in 8 years. He'd be 81. Elderly, institutionalized, with a felony record and no prospects. I thanked James for everything he'd done, not just with Raymond's case, but with BioLife, with protecting me, with helping me rebuild. He told me it had been the most satisfying case of his career, watching someone rise from nothing to reclaim their power. The other women from Raymond's past moved forward with their lives too. Susan Martinez in Florida recovered her credit with help from a victims advocate program. Alice Peterson in Nevada started a support group for elder abuse survivors. Diane Hartford reconnected fully with her children and became an advocate for financial literacy among widows. Patricia Morrison's sister Jennifer used the settlement money from a civil suit against Raymond to pay off her house. She called me once to thank me for speaking out, said she'd finally stopped blaming herself. As for me, life at 77 became something I'd never imagined possible. The royalties from BioLife continued growing. By the end of that year, they totaled over $800,000. The treatments developed from my plasma were now being used in 17 countries. Dr. Chen sent me quarterly updates with statistics: lives saved, children recovering, families kept intact. My body, the same body Raymond had called too old, was healing people around the world. I'd saved the BioLife earnings, let them accumulate. I already had more money than I needed from the original settlement. Now I started thinking about what to do with the excess, how to make it matter. I established a foundation with help from James and a financial advisor Sarah recommended, the Lorraine Mitchell Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention. We funded legal aid for elderly victims of financial exploitation, supported education programs about warning signs, and provided grants to organizations fighting these crimes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Raymond's cruelty had generated the money that was now helping protect people from predators exactly like him. I gave a significant donation to the Plasma Center, where I'd spent 18 months as a donor. They used it to upgrade their facilities and create a donor appreciation program. Patricia was promoted to manager. She called me crying when she heard about the donation, said she'd always known I was special. My children thrived. Sarah got promoted to partner at her law firm. David's construction business expanded to 3 cities. Michael's daughter, my granddaughter Emma, got accepted to MIT with help from the college fund I'd restored. I watched my family flourish with money that should have been theirs all along. Money Raymond had stolen, and I'd recovered through plasma running through my veins. But the best part of my new life was the freedom. I traveled extensively. Not the cruise ship tours that companies market to seniors, but real travel. I spent 3 weeks in New Zealand hiking trails that challenged my 77-year-old body. I went to Japan during cherry blossom season and stayed in a traditional ryokan. I visited the Galapagos Islands and saw wildlife that made me feel young with wonder. Sarah joined me for a trip to Ireland, where Robert's family had originated. We walked through old cemeteries looking for his ancestors' graves, drank Guinness in pubs, and talked about her father until I could remember him without the pain of loss overwhelming everything else. I bought a small cottage in Maine near the lighthouses I'd visited. Nothing extravagant, just 2 bedrooms with a view of the ocean. My children and grandchildren visited in the summer. We made new memories in a place Raymond had never touched. I also started writing. Not a book, just essays and articles about aging, about vulnerability, about resilience. Margaret helped me place them in publications that reached people who needed to hear these stories. I wrote about red flags in relationships, about trusting your children when they raise concerns, about the difference between loneliness and love. Hundreds of people reached out to thank me, mostly women, mostly my age, who'd either experienced similar situations or had narrowly avoided them. Some younger people, too, worried about their parents, grateful for the warning signs I'd described. I became an advocate without meaning to. I spoke at senior centers, testified before state legislatures about elder abuse prevention, gave interviews to journalists covering financial exploitation. Not because I enjoyed the attention, but because I remembered sitting in that plasma center at 73 thinking my life was over. If my story could prevent even one person from experiencing that despair, it was worth telling. The plasma donations continued, though now I donated at a private facility BioLife set up for me. Once every 6 weeks, they collected plasma under carefully monitored conditions. Each donation produced antibodies that went into treatment saving lives. Dr. Chen told me they'd named the antibody treatment after me. The Mitchell Protocol, they called it. My name was in medical journals, in research papers, in textbooks. 77 years old, and I was contributing to science. On what would have been my 50th wedding anniversary with Robert, I visited his grave. I hadn't been there since Raymond had come into my life, too ashamed of what I'd let happen, too guilty about betraying Robert's memory. I told him everything. About Raymond, about the plasma, about the money, about the foundation, about the lives being saved. I told him I was sorry for ignoring his children's warnings, for letting someone unworthy into the life we'd built. But I also told him I'd survived, that I'd turned devastation into purpose, that his grandchildren were thriving, that the legacy we'd built together was intact and growing. I told him I missed him every day, but I was okay now. Better than okay. As for Raymond, I heard occasional updates through Rita, who still monitored the situation more out of professional interest than my request. He was in prison, working in the library, keeping to himself. Some of the other inmates had apparently read about his crimes and didn't appreciate predators who targeted elderly women. Prison wasn't easy for him. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I didn't feel anything much at all. He'd become irrelevant to my story. a footnote, a catalyst for change, but not the focus anymore. 3 years after the trial, I received a letter forwarded through James. It was from Raymond, sent from prison. James had screened it first, made sure it wasn't threatening or manipulative, before deciding whether to pass it along. He left the decision to me. I could read it or throw it away unopened. I burned it without reading it. Whatever Raymond had to say, I didn't need to hear it. He'd lost the privilege of my attention. On my 79th birthday, my children threw me a party at the main cottage. All 3 kids, all 6 grandchildren, even some cousins I hadn't seen in years. We cooked lobster and corn, sat on the porch watching the sunset over the ocean, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a decade. Complete peace. Emma, my granddaughter, who was now a sophomore at MIT, asked me what the best part of getting older was. She was 19, the same age I'd been when meningitis nearly killed me. Young enough to think old age was something distant and unfortunate. I told her the best part was knowing yourself completely, understanding your worth independent of anyone else's opinion, and having nothing left to prove to anyone. I told her that at 79, I'd finally learned what Robert had tried to teach me during our 42 years together, that your value doesn't come from what you have or who wants you. It comes from who you are and what you choose to do with whatever life gives you. Even if what life gives you is betrayal and plasma worth millions. As the sun set and my family laughed around me, I thought about the journey from that kitchen table where Raymond had left me to this porch where I sat surrounded by love I'd earned and kept. I thought about the little girl I'd hugged at the BioLife Gala, alive because I'd been desperate enough to sell my blood. I thought about the women I'd helped through the foundation, the ones who'd escaped situations like mine because someone had finally told them they weren't alone. And I thought about Raymond in his prison cell, living with the knowledge that the woman he'd called too old and too poor had become exactly the opposite, using the very desperation he'd created. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't destroying your enemy. It was building something so magnificent from their cruelty that they had to live knowing they'd given you the tools for your own resurrection. I raised my glass to toast my children, my grandchildren, my 79 years of life with all its pain and triumph. And somewhere in California, in a federal prison, Raymond had 8 more years to think about the woman whose blood had been worth millions and the fortune he'd lost by underestimating her. I hope he thinks about it every single day. If this story resonated with you, if you know someone who needs to hear it, hit that subscribe button and share this video. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to rebuild your life from nothing. Sometimes the stories we share are the ones that save someone else. Remember, you're never too old, never too broken, never too late to reclaim your power and write a new ending. Thank you for listening to mine.